by the Romans under the pretenses that they're going to rescue him from the angry Jerusalem mob. See, he was in Jerusalem teaching and preaching, and when he was preaching and teaching Jesus, folks got angry because when you're preaching and teaching Jesus, somebody's always going to get angry. They say he is teaching everyone everywhere against our people and against our law and against this place. That's what the rulers of the temple say. They say he's riling everybody up. He's causing too much trouble. He's doing too much. We've never done it like that. We've never seen it this way. He's going too far. He's saying too much. And so a crowd turns into a mob, and they want to kill him. But he has another crime that he does. Not only does he preach Jesus, but he's also committing the crime of bringing Gentiles into the temple, which is seen by the leaders of the religious community as a high offense. See, Paul's real crime, when you get down to it, is that he's bucking traditions and inviting everybody to be a part of what God is doing. And I don't know if anybody understands, but I know at least 2 or 3 pastors in here know that every now and then when you buck God's people's tradition and follow God's plan, when you begin to do new ministry, when you begin to do new things, when you begin to do something folks never seen before, every now and then you'll get locked up for teaching Jesus. He has a habit of listening to God's voice and following God's lead, even when it puts him on the wrong side of the people who believe God has died and left them in charge. And so Paul gets into trouble. And the rulers of the temple, the Sadduceic leaders, the Pharisaic leaders, they want him dead. They want him dead because they can't stand that Paul is preaching Jesus. But it's not just that he's preaching Jesus. It's not just that he's welcoming in Gentiles into the temple, but they're also salty because he's changed up on them. He's gotten brand new on them all of a sudden. You remember Paul was a Pharisee of Pharisees. You remember Paul was Saul, a persecutor of Christians, who would have been right there with him trying to drown the church and shut down the church a few years before. But God has changed him. God has gotten a hold of him, and God has caused Paul to now be an example of what happens when the Holy Spirit gets a hold of your heart. This is a point for you today. It doesn't matter what you used to be. It doesn't matter where you used to go. It doesn't matter how you used to act. God is able to change and transform every heart and every soul. God is able to use anybody. God is able to get hold of any heart. God can move in any way. And so God gets hold of Saul, who is Paul, who once was murdering Christians and now is preaching the gospel. And they want him dead. Because when you start to do things God's way, you get a bullseye on your back. They want him dead because he's changed up on them and he's now serving Jesus. He's welcoming everybody to follow Jesus. They reject him because he won't reject anybody. They hate him because he won't hate anybody. They can't accept him because he's accepting any old body into the family of Jesus. And so they constantly look for ways to trap him, to take hold of him. This is what happens in Jerusalem among the crowd that becomes a mob. And when he's under the threat of the mob, the Romans swoop in and they take him into custody and they pretend as if they're going to protect him. He's a Roman citizen, so they say, well, what we'll do is we'll take custody of you to make sure you're safe. He goes from one trap to another. He goes from one enemy to another. Pastor, it's like sometimes when you're doing God's work, you can't win for losing. I don't know if your grandmama used to say that, but sometimes when you're trying to do things God's way, you can't win for losing. He finds himself in the crosshairs of systems that are determined to take him out and to silence his voice. And so from chapters 21 to 28, we are traveling with Paul. You must know that Paul is journeying to Rome, but he's not going there on a luxury cruise liner. He's not going there on the Carnival Triumph. He's not going there in style, looking good, feeling good. He goes to Rome to do God's work, but he does it as a prisoner under the watchful eye of guards and soldiers. Isn't it an interesting dichotomy? Isn't it a puzzling predicament that Paul is an apostle of Christ on the one hand, but a prisoner on the other? He's a man who is loved throughout the church on the one hand, but condemned by the world on another. He's living at the intersection of two very real realities at the same time. He's anointed but condemned. He's an apostle but a prisoner. He's just like so many of us who have come to understand that living for Jesus doesn't mean you won't take some knocks along the way. Is there anybody in here who can testify that when you're on a mission from heaven, sometimes you still got to deal with some hell along the way? And so Paul finds himself on a ship going there to Rome as a prisoner. He's condemned and he's in the crosshairs of Rome. And he's on his way to his destiny, but he's not going there in style. Paul is living a real life, y'all. Paul is not living the kind of rose-colored lives that we sometimes pretend God owes to God's people. Paul is not living this kind of false thing that we say we ought to get from God. Paul is a leader of God's church. Paul is an apostle of Jesus Christ. Paul is preaching and teaching and building everywhere he goes. And when you submit to God's call and you begin to build and to work, when you spend your life giving to people, when you spend your life in ministry, whether it be preaching, whether it be ushering, whether it be as a trustee, whether it be as a deacon, when you find yourself giving yourself, sowing yourself as a seed in God's church, when you find yourself doing the work of the kingdom, the reality is that you don't get a get out of hell free card. You have to deal with some stuff along the way. And Paul is living this kind of life, a life where he is marked for Jesus, but is also marked out for oppression. He's loved by God, but is also led about in chains. He's preaching a gospel of freedom, but is not free himself. He's preaching healing and wholeness, but has got brokenness in his own life. He's telling people that God can deliver you, but he's not been delivered. Paul finds himself going from city to city, from town to town, writing and preaching and declaring the love of Jesus to his compatriots and companions while he's under watchful eye of Roman overlords. And during this journey where he's going to Rome, where he's going to fulfill his destiny, but he's doing it in a prison ship, he penned some words of deliverance and power. He penned some words that we still read and still love to this day, but he does it while he's languishing himself. Pastor Slaughter, he is a prime example of what Henry Nouwen calls the wounded healer. He can't go and take care of his own brothers. He's been rejected from his own synagogue. He's been rejected from his own family. And pastors in the house, leaders in the house, people of God in the house, you know that feeling when you get to lay hands on the sick to recover, but you sick yourself. When you pray for somebody to get peace, but can't find peace in your own home. When you do everything you can to give to the kingdom and you still have lack in your own house. When you're trying to do the work of serving God and it feels like the journey is taking everything out of you. Paul is on a prison ship and he's going from place to place under the yoke of bondage, and he's trying to hold in his heart the true reality that God is with him even when it seems like hell is on his trail. And this is where we pick up in Acts chapter 27 and Acts chapter 28. What happens is that they've gone all over the place. Paul has found himself going from town to town, from city to city. Paul is at the mercy and whim of the empire as he travels to and fro. But even when Paul is on the chopping block, God is still on the throne. After trials, pastor, after beatings, pastor, after rejections, pastor, after pain and strain, after more problems than anybody should have to go through. And finally, he's almost at Rome. And then on top of everything else, text says a storm rolls in. Pastor, he's rolling out of chapter 27, going to chapter 28. And a storm rolls in. He's trying to get to where God has sent him to go, and a storm rolls in. Text tells us that a nor'easter, a great hurricane-force windstorm, begins to batter the ship for more than a week. They can't see the stars or the sun. Now, the only way you're going to navigate in this day is if you can see the stars and the sky, if you can see the sun in the sky. They don't know if they're going north or south. They don't know if they're going east or west. They don't know if it's day or night. All they know is they're being battered by something bigger than them. It gets so bad out there, y'all, that it's pitch black all day long for days on in. The wind is knocking them. The waves are battering them, and they are constantly soaked and ice cold. It's so bad that the storm beats them into submission to the point where we're told that everybody loses hope of ever being saved. Everybody on board. Now, Paul is on the ship, and it says everybody loses hope of being saved. Paul is on ship, and it says that everybody loses hope of being. Even Paul on the ship is a part of those who lose hope of what will happen, at least for a moment. But God is with them even in the storm. Y'all, it's so dark that they can't even make out the stars and the sun, but God is with them even when life becomes so dark and tumultuous that they can't see what they usually rely on to navigate through life. Every now and then, we will have storms that are so bad that we don't even know how to get from one chapter to the next, but they navigate not by the stars, not by the sun, but God walks with them. God moves with them. God directs them, and so they cannot die there because Paul has somewhere to go. Paul has a destiny, Pastor Slaughter, and he can't stop till he makes his destiny. Paul has somewhere to go, Pastor, and he can't give up until he gets there. And so even though the storm comes and destroys the very ship, text tells us that the ship is destroyed so much that everything falls apart into pieces, and people have to float in to the shore on broken pieces of the ship. But Paul continues on his journey to where he has to go. And then chapter 28 comes. Somebody say chapter 28. Somebody say chapter 28. This is how chapter 28 starts. The text tells us that the storm is so bad that the ship breaks apart under their feet. That what they've had security in, what they've been resting on, what they thought would keep them, it is no longer there. Everything changes. Come on, everything is different. And can we be honest that we've had the kind of last 17, 18 months where everything we thought we could depend on was no more. We've had the kind of 17 months, the last few months, where everything we thought was steady under our feet turned out to break up under us. So many of us have gotten to places where we lost people we thought would always be there. So many of us are in places where we lost connections we thought would always be our strength. So many of us have gotten to places where we didn't know if we could make it. And Paul gets to chapter 28 with the whole ship broken under his feet, but he keeps going because he's got somewhere to go. And in chapter 28, I'm almost finished. I feel like preaching right about now. We're told that he gets not yet to Rome, but he gets to an island called Malta. And when he gets to the island of Malta, there are some folks there. There are some natives there. There are some people who live there on Malta. And what they do is they build a fire for those who have survived the storm and survived the shipwreck. And when the fire is built, the text tells us that they build this fire and it is able to warm people. And I'm sure it gives them food. It gives them light. It gives them heat. It gives them warmth. And when they get there, Paul decides that he's going to do work and help to keep building the fire. Look at the text. Text tells us that people of Malta build the fire, but Paul is willing to put his hand toward the work. And so what he does is he comes along and he puts wood on the fire. The people of Malta had already built the fire before he got there, but Paul comes along and he puts wood on the fire. And when he puts wood on the fire and builds it up and gives it a source and strength, it's able to become what it was not before. Text says that the fire is built up by Paul, and it's built so much, y'all, that a serpent gets angry. There's a serpent near the fire. And pastors, whenever you start to build, there'll be some serpents near the fire. Text tells us there's a serpent that's drawn out by the fire that Paul is strengthening. Malta been there a long time before Paul got there. But once Paul gets there, he puts what God has placed in him onto what's already there. And the blaze begins to multiply to the point that the fire begins to disturb everything around it. And the text says that there are some sleeping sound serpents who are comfortable with how things were. And the fire that Paul builds causes them to get to biting. Now, I'm not talking about anything or anybody in particular, but I've only pastored a little while in comparison to you, Pastor. And I already know just in 6 years that when you begin to build the fire, some serpents will turn up. So I can imagine what you've been through in 28 years. I can imagine how many times you've been bit in 28 years. I can imagine how many times things have attached themselves to you, hoping to destroy you in 28 years. The text says the serpent bites, and when serpents bite, they puncture and they poison. Can you imagine 28 years of puncture wounds and poisonings? Can you imagine 28 chapters in, Paul finds himself just trying to build the fire, to bring some light, to bring some hope, to bring some heat. The fire is the salvation of everybody on the island. The fire is what's going to allow people to eat and to be preserved. But there are some comfortable serpents who come out of the fire. Pastor Slaughter, there are no chapters without challenges, not even those celebratory chapters. And one might think that after Paul has gone through all he has gone through and has gotten all the way near Rome, that maybe now he would finally have a calm, easy, problem-free end to his journey. But that's not so. We are told that when Paul shipwrecks and the folks from the ship float to the island, that a snake comes out of the fire. And it looks like he's a goner because Paul has been bitten for building. Somebody's wondering, what does he mean by that last line? Well, the text says that the reason the viper comes out in the first place is because Paul is building the fire. It says it is heat that drives the serpents out. It's driven out because Paul keeps putting wood on the fire. He keeps building the fire, and the snake doesn't like the heat and the warmth and the light. Pastor, as you celebrate 28 years, let me say out loud what you probably already know in your heart. Anytime you build, the vipers will come after you. If you build people, there will be vipers that come and say you're building the wrong people. If you build a neighborhood, there'll be vipers that say you're building in the wrong neighborhood. If you build a ministry that changes lives, there'll be people that say ministry shouldn't look like that. Whatever you build for Jesus, there will be vipers, snakes, and serpents that come out of the woodwork. 28 years later, you know it better than most. The snake can't stand the fire. It can't stand the dynamic combustion and the deep level change that's happening. The serpents don't like to be disturbed from cool, dry, dark places where it's easy to hide and to do dirt. When the light comes and the heat comes, serpents are pulled out and they begin to strike. And notice this, they strike at the hand of the one who's working. Notice this, text says that the serpent jumps right on the Paul and grips his hand as he's doing the work of building the fire. The reality is that, Pastor, if you don't want to get bit, stop doing the work. The reality is, ministry leader, if you don't want to get bit, stop doing the work. The reality is, father, husband, wife, if you don't want to get bit, stop doing God's work. The reality is, teacher, if you don't want to get bit, stop caring for those children. The reality is, a person who is a leader, if you don't want to get bit, stop doing the work of building God's kingdom among people whom folks say don't deserve it. If you don't want to get bit, just leave the work to others. Because whoever's doing the work is going to get bit. But Pastor, I'll say this to you because I know your heart after just a couple years. That might be encouraging to some people that they can stop the work and not get bit. But when you're called and anointed like you are, you can't ever stop the work until God gives you release. You already know this. You already know this. You can't ever give up on the work until God allows you the opportunity to do so. That as those who are called to be pastors and shepherds in God's house, we don't have the privilege of being stagnant in the kingdom. As a matter of fact, they say if you don't want to get a snake bite, simply all you have to really do is avoid where snakes live. But Pastor, I'm afraid there's no hope for you because when you're called and anointed by God, you don't get a choice to stay away from the viper's nest. When you've been called to shepherd, you don't get to choose whether or not to deal with folks. When you love people, you can't help but deal with people. You can't help but serve people. As pastors, we don't have the privilege of staying away from where the serpent holes might be.